Okay, so we are good to go. Good evening, good morning, everyone, and warm welcome to the latest gathering of Sitecore YouTube Jaipur. Uh, we are excited to start another insightful session together, and today we are honored to have two great Sitecore company members, Jim Petillo, who is an independent Sitecore consultant and a Sitecore Digital Strategy MVP, and Corey Smith, who is a Sitecore MVP and a Sitecore consultant. Along with this, they are very active community members. In today's session, we are hoping to learn more about Sitecore migration tips and tricks about for the next years. So I would like to hand over the first part of the session to Jim, and then the second part will be covered by Corey. So Jim, you may begin your presentation.
All right, let me get my screen share started. Okay. So we're going to get started. Welcome to Sitecore Content Migration Tips for Marketers. So in this session, I'm going to offer you some tips and tricks to make your migration project buttery smooth through the entire process. So to start, my name is Jim Petillo. I am a six-time MVP in the ambassador and strategy category. I've got about 10 years of Sitecore authoring and editing experience and about 20 years in the digital marketing and content space. So I'm going to drop in some quick plugs, starting with Sitecore Lunch that I co-host with Corey Smith. So Sitecore is, and he's the next person presenting, Sitecore Lunch is a weekly social meetup group where we have conversations about Sitecore and not about Sitecore. It's pretty well attended by members of the Sitecore community, and every once in a while, Sitecore employees will pop in too. To join us, you can join Slack at sitecore.chat. And then watch the general channel around 12:15 Eastern time in the US. Corey will drop in the Zoom URL and the password. And then Sitecore Lunch is also available in other locations around the world, like Europe. If you check on my next slide, you'll be able to find more information. And that is the R Sitecore subreddit. So the sub features community blog posts, events and user groups and different news about Sitecore around the world. And if you've got your blog that you wanted added, if you send me a message on Reddit, or you can send me a message in Slack, I'll add it to my RSS feed and then I can start promoting and putting your post together. So with that out of the way, let's get started. We're going to explore both Sitecore and content migration tips across three sections that cover the planning, the doing, and then what comes next. So first, we're going to start with planning. So like everything else, your content migration should have SMART goals and objectives. So those are going to help you determine sorry, I'm just having trouble with the slides here. Okay, help you determine your success. So some performance goals that you can include are improved page load speeds or better user experience. Some content goals you can include are improving the content quality and discoverability, and like better SEO with metadata and tagging. And you should always remember to collect your before benchmarks so you have something to measure against when you reach the end. So first, timing is everything. I have never had clients I work with say, I wish we had less time to migrate. So give yourself an adequate runway, because things can go sideways and you can always find some little activity that's going to fill in that extra time. If you use concrete dates, just be aware that they may change. So you should avoid tying your launch of your rebranded or brand new site to specific events. And if you're moving platforms, take when you need to be off of your current platform into account so that you can avoid paying licensing fees for a system that you're not going to be using anymore. So there are 4 factors that are going to affect your effort during migration. The chart on the right is by David Hobbs, and it illustrates how complex your migration is going to be. The distance, which is in the y-axis, is described as changes to the platform from none to new, and it's plotted against depth on the x-axis, which describes changes to the user experience from none to a full revamp. So the further out that you move on each axis, it kind of increases the difficulty as you go through. Weight, which is not on the slide, refers to the amount or the volume of content that's being migrated. Less content to move is going to take you less time and effort. And so you should consider phases if your migration complexity and the timeline don't allow you to do it all straight out in one go. So finding an exit, this is good. So some CMS platforms do not make it easy to leave. Explore and discuss your options to get your content and assets out of your current CMS and into Sitecore. The Sitecore Data Exchange Framework supports many formats, so you do have options, but it can be tricky to use. There are some third-party tools and platforms that can help you, like Gather Content, and there's others that are popping up out there too. I believe there's one that's called Merlin. And if you're migrating from Sitecore to Sitecore, if you use packages, it's going to make things a little bit easier. And for general help and tips on moving to the cloud, you can consult Sitecore's new migration advisor at migration.sitecore.com. So automated versus manual migration. So while we're talking about getting content out, let's talk about the differences that you're going to run into here. So contrary to popular belief, automation is not a silver bullet, and it's not any easier than manual migration. There's no simple migration script that's going to move your content into multiple components and assemble their pages into the proper layouts for you. That's kind of what your authors have to do. So any automated migration that you do will always need to be followed up by some manual effort to verify and correct any issues with the content that's being brought over. With automated migration, the development of automation scripts requires developer effort, and it's a lot of trial and error to ensure everything is mapped and moved over as requested. So automation also works best when the content being processed is structured, consistent, and easily targetable by a migration script. So you'll have better odds automating highly structured content over hand-coded HTML. And with automation, content transformations like converting links to point to new items might not be possible. And that's going to be something that your authors are going to have to fix. So any new content being developed outside of your CMS and not in range of your scripts is also going to need to be moved manually into the new system. And then automation won't ever be moving the whole site at once. It always works better when it's divided into smaller pieces that the authors can use to then assemble pages. And again, works best for items that are in simple, consistent formats like press releases or databases of structured items like locations or people. And content can also be scraped and added into a single RTE field that authors will need to reformat into a better layout using text and other different components that you get put onto your site. So turning to the other side now, manual migration can start right away once the needed templates and components are in place, and it requires no extra development time. If all the content and assets are also available and ready to move, manual effort can be done in one pass with no iterations needed. It's rare, but sometimes it does happen. And then content can be reviewed and edited in real time with built-in QA and ROT analysis by your authors. So one last note here too, effort for automation should be gauged against other development efforts needed on the project, like for templates and for components. So try and suss out how much efficiency you're really going to gain with automation over manual migration, and then decide. Any sites that are less than 1,000 pages might not be good candidates for automated migration, and it could go better manually with a larger team of resources available. So starting out with your inventory, you can have a point in time content inventory done with an SEO crawler tool like Screaming Frog. Additional crawler tools that you can use include Sitebulb and URL Profiler. There's one that I like to use. It's really old. It's called Xenu's Link Sleuth. It's a free PC-based application, but it can be a little bit finicky. And then another tool called Content Chimera by David Hobbs will take your inventory and provide a deeper analysis and graphical representations of your site content and migration plan and progress. So it's a huge system that will really take your migration and kind of map it out visually for people that are more visually responsive. And then don't forget to inventory your pages that might get missed because they're intentionally hidden. Things like campaign pages, or if they're behind a login, a crawler might not be able to get through it. So once you've got that going, categorize like pages by your type or template so you can edit the sheet fields for your different properties in bulk. And then start moving into your audit with columns for decision points. Only include the data that you feel is going to help you make decisions, like the number of page views from analytics to determine how popular a page is, or the last updated or published date to determine how fresh or relevant that content is. So now you're going to continue into your audit by identifying pages with complex layouts, forms, and third-party integrations that might take longer to author or require a little bit more dev effort to build. Set up some reasonable criteria and rules to define how to handle your rot content. And as shown there, it's content that is redundant, outdated, and trivial. So for example, the last 3 years of press releases, we're going to move over as is, and then the rest of them we can drop. Or all the top level pages that we're going to create are going to have new copy and a new header image added. So jot down your recommended editorial treatments too, with a column for migration action. And you can tag your pages as new, edit, consolidate, keep as is, or remove. And then always add a column for effort, which is none, low, medium, and high. This is going to help document the migration effort as you move into your migration plan into later steps. And we'll discuss that further down. So we figured out what we have, what we want to do with it, and now we need to figure out how to arrange it. So spreadsheet formats can make visualization difficult. So create a visual representation of your site map using Figma, Miro, or some type of other graphical flowcharting software. And depending on your site size, a large sitemap in Figma might be unwieldy. So consider smaller detailed maps by section that can roll up into a larger map. And then as you have your sitemap, use different colors, patterns, and icons to represent the different aspects of your site, like different content types and templates. And then you can use stacks to represent large numbers of similar pages instead of individual pages to keep things like articles, events, and blog post areas simple. If possible, illustrate the links and relationships to other sections of your site for shared content. And then track your current URLs and their future URLs in your inventory because you're going to be using those for your redirect plan. So as you map out your URLs, here are some tips on naming conventions. So every Sitecore URL should lead to a page that has content. In some cases, you might want an item to exist solely to make a good URL for SEO purposes without a page, like a blog. So if the need is for a descriptive URL for SEO purposes, this item needs to be a folder with a redirect. This way, the user is going to get to, if the user types it in directly, they're going to get redirected to somewhere that actually has content on the page. And if pointing at just the first child item isn't going to work, discuss where that URL should go to. Or if a landing page with a dynamic listing or some other content needs to be spun up in order to support that. For naming conventions, items that will use numbers should have leading zeros to help with sorting. This is going to ensure that 10 and 11 come after 2 and not before it. And the same applies to dates. So if you go by year, month, and then date, November will come after October and not before. So as you go into your migration plan, you're going to have to start gauging that effort needed to satisfy all of the audit rules that you came up with. So how long is it going to take to write and produce assets for all those new top level pages? And how many new top level pages do you have? Take into account all the new content that you'll be creating and the design and editing time for content that is being merged and consolidated. People sometimes forget that. If it doesn't pencil out with the time or the resources that you have available, and you can't add resources or extend a deadline, just keep iterating on the rules until you can get something to work. And then don't forget, you can always move less critical content in later phases or move more content as is instead of creating new content from scratch to lower the effort and give you a little bit more time. So one final note on effort. Every site has 1 or 2 pages that I like to call Franken pages. So these are like custom pages that are custom built pages that stick out from their surrounding pages and templates by virtue of being a pet project or something running up against strict requirements or the implementation of third-party apps using raw HTML to add functionality to your site instead of using an existing component. So the resulting page is usually this bolted together combination of 2 or more page templates, or it uses an iframe, or some unnaturally occurring collection of components from multiple placeholders that's used to display content from different sources. These pages should definitely be considered complex if you're not redoing them as a new component or as a brand new template. And they also make good candidates for design exercises. So next, we're going to organize your content into your different batches and start to prioritize. So some content on the site is going to need to go first, just by nature of being needed or used in other pages or components, like a service or a specialty that's only available at select locations or from select people. And that fills in, or content that fills in a required field that you can't publish an item without. So while it seems counterintuitive to migrate the most technically difficult or complex content first, doing so is going to give you the most time to resolve any issues that's going to arise from it. And this can include content that needs extra review or attention, like those Franken pages. So easier, low effort content can be done at any time and can be used to fill in gaps throughout the migration process. So if you've got a lag, you can throw some low effort pages in there and give the content authoring team something to work on while that issue gets resolved. Content should also be prioritized prioritized alongside the templates and the components needed to build them. So this kind of ensures that complete pages can be built and entered in as one or as few passes as possible. And then volatile content is content that's going to change frequently throughout the course of your migration. So stakeholders hate the term content freeze. Authoring terms dread dual development and rework across the 2 systems. So the effort involved in touching pages multiple times to keep it current when nobody is going to see it in the new system until it launches, that time's better spent elsewhere. You should move this content last or build it once for review and then update it during the later content freeze. Ask stakeholders to help you keep track of anything new that gets added after your point-in-time inventory is run, because you're going to need to reconcile that at the end. And now let's start migrating. So first and foremost, understand that the environment that you're going to be working in is a work in progress, and it doesn't reflect the final product of your site. Explain to your authors that something they did may not have caused the entire site to crash and not to get discouraged. Consider people that are new authors in particular tend to be a little bit twitchy on, oh, did I break the entire site when I move this rich text field from one rich text component from one spot to another? Chances are it didn't happen. So you want to inspire them to be confident and author with confidence. You should consider suspending the use of workflow and making everybody a super user and admin just to facilitate entering in the content more quickly. Begin with page stubs for any content that you're going to migrate manually. This will allow you to update links that you come across and make them point to their new locations. And start small. Assign a few pages at the start of each batch to let everybody kind of kick the tires, get everyone on the same page for specific needs for any given template or component. These small runs can help validate the effort estimates for content entry and QA that you put into your plan. And it'll give you a chance to pivot if there's an issue that pops up. So optimizing your media. Large images can cause a drag on page load times. So as you start adding your assets, optimize them before adding them into the media library. Dianoga is a great add-on for Sitecore to further optimize your images, but it's not a replacement for best practices. It's an enhancement. And it'll also convert images to lighter web-friendly formats like WebP and SUG. So, and if you're putting your assets into Content Hub instead of the media library, consider making component-specific renditions to optimize your page heroes or your content cards. And you can trigger them only when necessary with scripts, not automatically when content gets added. And this will keep down the clutter inside of your Content Hub instance. So adding assets to the media library can take some practice, and new authors, again, can make some easily fixable mistakes. So monitor your media library throughout the migration process and help get your assets into the right places. So sometimes items wind up in the root folder of the media library or the wrong folder if the location doesn't get set. This headshot image is clearly out of place in the header folder, and it should be moved where someone can expect to find it in order to fix this. And then sometimes assets wind up nested under other images, which makes for really, really odd URLs. So you'll notice these two extra images don't show up in the right-hand panel, and they won't otherwise be discovered because the parent image is acting like a folder. You can move these out from underneath the parent image, and that'll fix that. And then sometimes authors will upload multiple images into a folder to give stakeholders multiple options to choose from. So once a selection is made, you should delete the unused images and look for items with no usages shown, and you can safely delete them. And then sometimes authors will add duplicate images. It just happens. You can reconcile this by getting rid of the unused or the least used image, and then repoint the item, repoint that item to the remaining image using the prompts that come up when you delete it. So moving on to naming and organizing. Name and organize your components in their data folder. Naming and organizing your components in their data folders can make for better maintenance for authors and for your content maintainers. This is also important with reusable global items. So there's some simple visual cues that are really going to help you out here. So if you don't do anything, your components will take on their names by default, with the addition of the same component being numbered, but without the leading zeros. So now you can see how, as you can see, this isn't going to be helpful. And you can't really tell one call out or text component from another. It's a bigger problem when it happens in your global folder of reusable content that only contains the same component. So just adding descriptive names to your duplicated components are going to help authors find the component they need to edit just a little bit faster. And then if you take it a step further and order the components in your folder in the same order that they appear on the page, you're giving future authors and maintainers additional visual cues that are going to help them find the component that they need to manage. So avoid lorem ipsum and placeholder images. Oh, I could tell some stories about this. So lorem ipsum is designed to be visually deceptive. So someone doing a quick QA pass on your site may not realize that the real content is not there. Fancy ipsum generators like bacon ipsum and placeholder generators like placekitten are cute for comps, but not so cute when they accidentally get published and get indexed, and then your site visitors see them, and then they kind of lose trust in your site. As your migration progresses, you will come across a few square pegs, and these are small issues that can be noted in your sheet or whatever ticketing system you're using to track your migration. Larger blocking issues should get addressed as soon as possible to keep your migration plan on track. Some examples of what you should look out for are content for new required fields that you didn't have before, like new subtitles, or content cards that must have an image or a link in order to be published. And you can also find content that's not in the right format, like trying to add rich text or HTML into a simple text field that's not going to support that formatting. There's also new content taxonomy or tagging needed for that one section's pages to be visible in a dynamic view. I mean, that often gets forgotten as well. And finally, images that are in the wrong size or format, like having a JPEG but needing an SVG or vice versa. So new fields being introduced during the migration of existing content are most commonly overlooked. A way to shave down the corners on square pegs is with guides. So if you construct content guides for new items and checklists to verify against your existing items, this is going to help ensure that all the required fields and parts for your components are going to get filled out. There's also an opportunity for you to add missing metadata for pages and things like alt text for images. And a big part of helping authors make good decisions are your insert options and assigning data source folders to fields. So when it comes to insert options for pages and components, too many options can be just as bad as too few. Component selection panels with 2 rows of tabs are a nightmare to navigate through, and they're going to slow down your authoring. Data source folders for component fields are also key to ensuring that media and content items come from and are added to the right folders on your new site. Branch templates can also help streamline your authoring and allow you to design a page once, but reuse it many times. It helps to ensure that authors are consistent with building out the pages, and it'll really reduce that design time. If you keep your branch templates simple, use a base layout and the components needed just to provide a backbone for the page. And then authors can flesh out those pages with custom components or features where they're needed. And it's quicker than building the entire page from zero. And now QAing and UAT as you go should be one of the golden rules, because QA should happen a lot. Authors should be performing their own content QA as they go, noting any issues or missing broken items in your spreadsheet. And you should QA your forms and your videos too. And perform official content QA at the completion of each content batch, and only on the items that are marked ready for QA. Proceed with user acceptance testing carefully. Let reviewers know that this is their chance to see how their page is going to look at launch, and not an opportunity to rework the entire page. Have them stick to the content blessed by content guides or something that's in the sheet. Their change of opinion is not a bug. So hold firm and then save any new ideas for post-launch phases of the project. So take notes as you and your authoring team go through the migration and page building process, and you can discuss them during office hours and working sessions and really maintain that forward momentum as you go through your migration. You can use these notes to build out your documentation and put together tip sheets. Complex templates, tricky components, and rough processes that can't be fixed in that instant can be prioritized against other items in your post-migration backlog. And then training's another item that often gets neglected. So find a quiet time with no distractions and make recordings for each template using a solo Teams meeting of one. So these recordings can supplement your live demos or make for good documentation. And then create example pages for authors to have as a reference to keep consistency in how pages or components are added and assembled. Scheduling working sessions or office hours promotes people learning and resolving problems together. So they're always a good way. People kind of love to commiserate and compete. Get your documents going and get your docs going and start your documentation in Confluence or any other system that you are working with, and have sections in there for templates, components, and processes. And revisit it as necessary if your components or templates change during and after your migration. And if you do the screenshots last, it ensures that your docs have the most up-to-date images in them. As you approach the end of your migration, it's time to do some content catch-up. So verify your running list of content added to your current site is accurate with a quick content like rerunning with a quick content inventory, and then surface any new pages that got added but weren't accounted for, and then add them into the queue. And then grab your jacket because it's time for a freeze. So try and have as much of the regular content done before the freeze hits. This is going to allow you to focus on the new and updated items you put to the side to avoid maintaining content in two places, and try and keep the freeze as brief as possible. So do a last minute spot check on any problematic batches or batches of content, or a quick visual scan of the site to verify everything's in place. And then run a link checker that's going to ensure everything's pointing where it should be, keeping an eye out for broken links, non-relevant, non-relative, like hard-coded links that are pointing to your current site with either the full domain name in place or pointing at your development or your staging environments. And now we are ready to launch. So once your site is launched, run a more detailed check to ensure that everything's working in different browsers and devices. Run that link checker one more time and make sure that all your content made it over and nothing got left behind. And then go through and submit each and every one of your forms to make sure that they show up in your CRM and that the confirmation pages are working. And then test any other integrations you may have to ensure that they're all pointing to the correct spot. If you've made it this far, take time to celebrate, then take a breath and refocus on your next steps. So allow for some soak time, and then recollect the data to measure against your initial goals. So check for disruptions in traffic, like 404 errors could be missing pages or redirects. Low conversion rate means forms might not be working in some spots. If you're seeing high bounce rates or longer page load times, it could mean that there's page errors or other issues that are present. And then review your exit pages to make sure people aren't leaving for an obvious thing that you might have missed. If your new site's missing the mark, figure out why, make your improvements, and then recheck. And with everything launched, it's time to get back into your regular maintenance routine. So turn your workflow on and admin access off, and then start assigning roles to your authors. Keep your workflow as simple as possible, starting with a draft, review, and publishable model. Your Sitecore instance can report back with workflow notifications either in email or even in a dedicated Teams channel. And when you're creating and assigning your user roles, assume good intent. So give users the right training and information and restrict permissions just enough to ensure that any mistakes that they make are not going to be catastrophic. Keeping the roles simple is going to make rollout quick, and it's going to be easier to maintain. And then finally, it's time to do the iterative work on your site. So you're going to start on your phase 2 items and turn your process improvement notes into action items, and then take maintenance and your new content creation into account. And schedule regular inventories, audits, and reviews of your content by section to ensure that you're going to be keeping true to the site goals that you set at the start. And that's it. I can kind of open it up for questions now, if there are any.
I guess there is one question in the chat window.
No questions? Well, I'm available if people come up with any after.
Yeah,
I know sometimes it can be asking in front of a crowd can be a little intimidating. So,
yeah, Jim, we have some question.
oh, okay.
S- Yeah. So the first one is like, do you know the best way to optimize the image for CMS when uploading? As I use Dynoga only. So like, no, as you mentioned that it's better to optimize the image while we upload that on the Sitecore, right? We use Dynoga so that optimize the image at the runtime. So like, can you just describe a bit about that?
Sure. So a lot of times groups that I work with, they will just say, oh, they take an image off of Stocksy or istock.com, and it's this 8,000 by 3,000 pixel image. And they just like, that's the one we want. And they just drop it into the media library. And now your Dianoga is going to take that and then crunch it. And it just takes a lot of processing time in order to make that happen. So if you optimize your images and get them as small and tight as possible before you move them in, Dianoga will kind of work quicker and your site will rebuild faster. I hope that answers the question.
Yep. So that means that will be a kind of manual process, right?
Yes, usually your graphics team should be the one that
Mm-hmm.
optimizes your images down first. Like I said, they shouldn't be handing over print ready, because the differences between print ready images and screen ready images are huge when it comes to size. So you want to try and just keep those image sizes and weights as down as much as possible, and then let all of the enhancements that happen, whether it's converting it to WebP or just using Dianoga to further optimize the image, it'll be that much sweeter and that much better of a lift.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We have a couple of questions from Anish. So Anish, you can unmute yourself and I guess you can speak.
Oh, hi. Thanks. So yeah, I just wanted to check like how to best keep track of any compatibility mismatches. Like most of the time, what I've seen that the client wants to migrate from a very old version, say 6 and 7, something those webs and to 10 directly. So how we can keep track, or like obviously we have to do more study, like if there's any version mismatches in between, or is there a best practice like no, we have to first go from one version to another that way? And is there any best way to move the items? Like we know that we can do the packages, we just saw that. So I move the item from one site for instance to another. But when we are moving from very old versions, what kind of issues or what kind of best practices maybe you can suggest?
So the thing with moving from older versions is it gets really difficult. A lot of what your inventory and your audit is going to do is going to point out which pages are going to require more time or a little bit more effort in order to make that content match or bring it up to code so it'll work better in the new version of Sitecore. So generally, like I suggest, you should try and track the effort that it's going to take to build these pages, which pages are going to be more difficult to migrate over, because a script isn't always going to work. Manually migrating, sometimes manually migrating is going to be your best and only option, especially on some of these older versions of sites where a PowerShell script might be iffy, whether or not it works or not. But I've also seen on newer versions of sites too, where there's some PowerShell scripting you can do that will take your content from the old Sitecore version, move it into the newer Sitecore version, and just put everything in like this ready state where your authors then can come in, they can change the template or change the component that's being used using the configure menu, and have most of the content there. So, I mean, that takes some of the lift off of just copying and pasting and then adding something new.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, we have one question from Vishwas as well. So Vishwas, please unmute yourself and you can ask.
So related to content migration, we talked about like automated and manual approaches that we can define. I mean, what best suits in our conditions, circumstances, and project wise. But sometimes it feels like when we look at the content that some part maybe like better suits for automation, and some part is like better for manual. So should we recommend to have the mixed approach and putting effort in that kind of direction, or what do you suggest?
So generally, like I said, the best thing to kind of do is you have to gauge the effort for what it's going to take to automate that content moving over versus is it going to be easier for a person to do that? Because the automation part, it really depends on how good the scripts that you're using are developed and how intense they are for parsing things out and moving it from A to B and making sure things wind up in the right fields. So you can do it for a lot of basic stuff like site metadata, things that are, like I said, that are structured, that you're literally a field to field moving exercise. Those type of things can be manually can be automated and be automated successfully. The problem comes when you have like a component or a series of components on a page that are going to be different from what's currently set up. So you can't have a script that's going to automate and pick which section of this rich text is going to go here and which section of it is going to go into this other part of the site or this other component. So that's where the manual process comes into play. So because I mean, you can try, it's really like how much effort do you want to spend on making your scripts as sophisticated as possible to move things over. I mean, you're not, so I guess you're taking the time from manually migrating to invest that time into building your automation scripts. So it's really one of those decisions where you're going to have to weigh that against the amount of time that you have and how much effort you've got. Like if you've got a lot of components and a lot of templates to build and a lot of styling that needs to happen, you might not have as much free dev time to be able to iterate over and over again on a script to try and get everything to move in perfectly. So you might just have to take more of a shotgun approach and move everything into one RTE and then have the content authors go into that RTE, and then at least the content's there and they're not moving from one site to another. And then they can just rearrange that content into existing components through copy and paste on the site.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess we are covered with all the questions. So thank you, Jim. Thanks a lot for all the information that you shared through your presentation. And I hope if anyone will have anything related to migration, they can follow this and they can get in touch with you directly to Slack or other social media platform.
Absolutely. Thank you
Okay.
for having me.
Thanks a lot. Okay, now it's time to move on to the next session by Corey to cover tips and tricks for Next.js. So Corey, you may start the presentation. You're on mute.
The presentation showing?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, nice. Nice talk, Jim. Thanks for that. Learned a lot from your presentation. And now I'll be presenting tips and tricks for Next.js and Sitecore Headless. My hope with this talk is that you're able to walk away from it and implement these tricks on your Next.js and Sitecore Headless projects right away. So I'm Corey Smith. I'm an independent consultant living in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm an 8-time Sitecore MVP of technology, and I've got over 9 years of Sitecore experience. I'm a happy dad to an almost 2-year-old, and I'm also a lawn care and smooth jazz enthusiast. So if you're interested in lawn care, smooth jazz, or Sitecore, of course, please reach out to me on Slack. My username is Sitecore, and you can check out my blog and my website at corysmith.co. Jim covered this during his presentation, but I'm going to cover it again because we would like to see you this Friday and every Friday. Every Friday at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time, I co-host Sitecore Lunch with Jim. And Sitecore Lunch is just a virtual meetup for the Sitecore community. We get together and talk about Sitecore, of course, but often we talk about things not related to Sitecore. Just a really good opportunity to meet community members and learn more about what's going on in the Sitecore space. As Jim mentioned, we frequently have Sitecore employees drop in and share interesting tidbits about the product. So if you want to join us every single Friday at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time, I'll post the details to join in the general channel on the Sitecore Slack. If you're not on the Sitecore Slack, it's easy to join. Just go to that URL there, sitecore.chat. And I hope to see you all this Friday. Our first tip today is looking at the debug logging functionality available in Sitecore's Next.js SDK. Sitecore's Next.js SDK ships with really extensive debug logging functionality that's provided by an NPM package called debug. When enabled, this debug logging functionality will output tons of handy debug information to the console and the browser for things like layout service requests and dictionary service requests. This is really helpful when you're trying to diagnose issues with your site. This functionality is hiding in plain sight in every Sitecore JSS Next.js project. So if you open up the .env file in your Next.js project, you'll see this block of commented out stuff there. And to turn on the debug logging, it's quite easy. All you have to do is uncomment this line here. When you uncomment this line, this will enable all of the debug logs that are available from the Next.js application. But if you want to get more specific, you can. So you could uncomment this line instead. And what this line will do is it will only show debug logs for the layout service. But you can get even more selective than that. So say you want to see everything but the layout service logs. There's an example of that in the .env file right here that you can uncomment. And this will show you all logs but the layout service logs. So you can get pretty granular with what you want to have output from this. One thing that you won't see in the .env file is this setting here. It's called debug multi-line. I highly suggest that you take note of this. If you enable debug logging, you're going to want to turn this on because it makes debug logs more readable in the console. So when you turn on debug logging by uncommenting one of those lines that I showed before, this is what the debug logging will look like in your server console, and it's kind of hard to parse. But if you set debug multi-line equals true, you get a much friendlier, much easier to read layout from your debug logging. And I prefer this view. I make sure that I've always got debug multi-line set to true when I use debug logging. JSS ships with a ton of debug log filters, and this is an exhaustive list of all of them. So we talked about before how you can look at just the layout service logs. If you want to get and look at other things, like you could look at just the dictionary service logs, you could look at just the logs from data fetchers. If you're trying to diagnose issues with your editing host or the experience editor or pages, you can filter down to the editing host logs. If you're using Headless SXA, there are log filters for the sitemap service, the site info service, robot service, redirect service, and the error pages service. And then if you're using CDP or personalize, there's a filter just for those services as well. If you want to turn on debug logs in the browser, the process is slightly different. So when you go and uncomment those lines in the .env file, that's only going to turn on debug logging for the server console. It's not going to affect the browser at all. To enable debug logging in the browser, what you'll do is you'll open up the console in your browser and you'll set the debug property on local storage to the filter that you want to see. So in this case, if you wanted to see all of the debug logs, you would just do local storage.debug equals Sitecore JSS star. And then when you do this, you'll start seeing debug logs in the browser. Now, it's important to take note that only things that happen on the client or in the browser will appear in the browser console. Server-side events aren't going to appear here. So with a new Sitecore JSS Next.js application, most everything is happening on the server during server-side rendering or static site generation. So things like layout service requests and dictionary service requests, you're not going to see them show up in the browser console like from the debug logging. But we'll come back to this in a minute and I'll show where this can be really useful. So to recap, you can enable debug logging for the server in the .env file by uncommenting those lines that I showed or tweaking them to your liking. Make sure that you always set debug multiline equals true for better readability. And you can enable debug logging for the browser by setting the debug property on local storage. And in fact, if you want to set up your own namespaces for your application, you can do that using the npm debug package. So Sitecore's documentation on debug logging is at that first URL. And if you're interested in setting up your own filters, I highly recommend checking out the npm debug documentation. It shows you how to do that and a lot of other cool things. Our next tip looks at data fetchers provided by the JSS libraries. So the Sitecore JSS library exports 3 data fetchers that you can use in your application. There's the native data fetcher, which is a wrapper around fetch. There's the Axios data fetcher, which is a wrapper around Axios. And then there's the GraphQL request client, which is really configured to make calls to the Sitecore GraphQL APIs. It has really nice retry logic and handles rate limiting of those APIs. For general API calls, you're going to use the native data fetcher. If you like Axios and have a really good reason to use it, go ahead. You can use the Axios data fetcher, but I'm going to recommend that probably for 99.9% of people, you're going to want to use the native data fetcher for just general API calls. And the reason for that is since it wraps fetch, the native data fetcher is going to get any kind of improvements that Vercel or the Next.js team make to fetch over time. For example, Vercel has recently added some new features to fetch like caching and request deduplication. And if you use the native data fetcher, you'll get those features for free as you upgrade Next.js. You wouldn't get those with the Axios data fetcher. But the overall advantage of using all of these is that they actually implement debug logging under the hood. So when you make an API call using one of these data fetchers, you can easily debug them by using that HTTP filter that I mentioned before with debug logging. They're easy to use. All you have to do, like if you want to use the native data fetcher, is just import it from the Sitecore JSS Next.js library, make a new instance of it, and then the API for fetching with the native data fetcher is almost identical to just using fetch directly. If you want to see debug logs for these data fetchers, all you have to do in your env file is set debug to Sitecore JSS star or Sitecore JSS HTTP if you just want to see logs from those data fetchers. And then of course, turn on debug multiline equals true. And then any calls that you make on the server using one of those data fetchers will show up in your server console like this. You can see the request and you can see the response, and that's quite handy. If you set the debug property on local storage to Sitecore JSS HTTP, any calls that you make using those data fetchers in in the client, for example, in a use effect hook, those will start showing up in the browser console like this. So to recap, use the native data fetcher in your application instead of fetch. If you've got a good use case for it, you can use the Axios data fetcher instead of Axios. Anytime you're calling the Sitecore GraphQL APIs, use the GraphQL request client because it's got really nice handling for errors and rate limiting. And then the nice thing about using all of these is that they implement debug logging, so they're quite handy for diagnosing issues with your site. This next tip is going to focus on supercharging data fetching on the client. So anytime that you want to make an API call in a React component, you're going to use this pattern. You got to use two hooks. You've got to use the use state hook and the use effect hook, right? This is just the way that you do API calls in React. You're going to declare some state using the use state hook, and then you'll use the use effect hook to actually make your API call. Inside of that use effect hook, when you make your API call, once the data comes back from the API, you'll use the setter that you get from the use state hook to set your state, and then this will trigger a re-render of your component where you can actually render the data from the API. While the state is null, you might show a loader, and then once the state is actually populated from your API call, then your component will refresh and you'll show the data from the API. This works. This is the standard pattern for making API calls in React, but frankly, it's kludgy. I don't really like having to use two separate hooks to make an API call. So there's actually a better way where you don't have to make these two, use these two hooks. It's a lot cleaner. It's a library called SWR from the Vercel team. And this is a new hook that you can use just for data fetching. SWR, by the way, stands for stale while revalidate. And again, this is developed and maintained by Vercel, the company that builds Next.js. So let's take a look at that. Here's that same component from before, but I've rewritten it using SWR to make the API call. You can see that now instead of having to use state and use effect, I'm just using one single hook, use SWR to make my API call. The first thing that you pass to SWR is the URL of the API that you're calling. In this case, we're calling the CatFact API. And then the second thing that you pass to SWR is a generic fetcher function. And this just tells SWR how you want the data to be retrieved. Because SWR doesn't have any capabilities to make requests for you. You've got to tell it how to do that. Once you've provided those things to SWR, it's going to return some really handy information to you. This is just a small subset. There's a whole lot of other things that it returns, but the key things that you're going to be using most of the time are a Boolean called isLoading that's true or false, whether or not the API call is loading. An error object if any error information comes back from the API, and then the data object will have the data once your API call is finished. And now instead of doing something like checking if your state is null or whatever, you can be more specific in your component and say, while the API call is loading, show the loader, otherwise show the data from the API. And I think that's a lot cleaner code. But clean code is not the only reason to use SWR. It actually comes with a ton of features. So some of the major features that you get when you use SWR are auto refetching and request deduplication, which we're about to look at. SWR makes it really easy to set up queries that depend on each other. It supports caching, prefetching, pagination, and infinite scroll. And here we're going to look at two of those features in action. So what I've got on this page is a component that's calling the CatFact API, and I've added that same component to the page 4 times. What I'm doing here is I'm clicking in the browser and then clicking out, clicking back in and clicking out. And you'll notice that every time that the browser regains focus, we get a new CatFact on all the components. So this is the auto refetching capability that you get with SWR. And you don't even have to do anything to get this. As soon as you start using the SWR hook, this just works. There's another thing that's happening that's a little bit more subtle. So that cat fact API, every time you call it, it returns a unique cat fact. If this component had been implemented using the combo of use state and use effect, you would actually see 4 different cat facts on the page for each instance of the component on the page. But SWR is quite cool because it implements request deduplication for you. So what SWR sees happening here is that the same API call is being made by multiple components on the page, and it'll just make that API call one time and then share it across all the components. So again, this is something you don't even have to configure, you get for free. Quite a nice performance benefit for your pages. I mentioned before that the second thing that you pass to SWR is a generic data fetcher function. So in the example I showed before, I was just using fetch, but since it's just a generic fetcher function, you can actually use one of the JSS data fetchers instead. So here I've shown an example of using the native data fetcher from JSS to make the API calls for SWR. And the benefit of doing this is that now you're going to get debug logging anytime that you use SWR. So now when you go and set local storage debug to Sitecore JSS HTTP, like I mentioned before, any calls made through SWR using that native data fetcher will be logged to the console in the browser. You can see the request and the response there. There's a really nice browser extension called SWR DevTools. If you add this to your browser, you'll get an SWR tab that you can use for debugging SWR. So to recap, SWR simplifies client-side data fetching. I didn't cover it today, but there's actually an alternative to SWR called React Query that's worth investigating for your projects. Here's the documentation for SWR and the URL to download the SWR DevTools. And if you're interested in React Query, there's the link to that as well. So this is a tip about working in XM Cloud Pages and the Experience Editor. This tip doesn't apply to just Next.js, actually. It applies to all development models in Sitecore. XSLT, web forms, MVC, Angular, Vue, Next.js, it doesn't matter. This is a hard requirement for Experience Editor and Pages. The requirement is that you must wrap your components in a single real root element. So I sometimes see components that are wrapped in a fragment like you see here. The fragment is not a real element. Don't do this. If you do, styles will get broken in Experience Editor and Pages. Inline editing won't work properly when you insert the component on the page, and placeholders inside of a fragment like this won't work properly either. Instead, ensure that your components always have a real root element, such as a div or a span. And if you do this, you and your content authors will be so happy. I think that this might be a good opportunity for an ESLint or a Prettier plugin for the community to develop, because it seems like this is something that should be easy to pick up with static analysis. All right, for this tip, we'll look at a feature in the Sitecore Next.js SDK that will help you with upgrades of the SDK, and that's Next.js config plugins. So in the root of your Next.js application, there's a Next config.js where you can configure all of Next.js's settings. With a new Sitecore Next.js application, the Next.js config already has a bunch of stuff configured. There are a lot of things that you can adjust with the Next config. Some of the things that you can change are environment variables, default headers, image behavior. You can configure redirects and rewrites for the Next.js server, or configure Webpack settings. But modifying these things directly in the Next config can make upgrades of your project a little bit more difficult. If you're coming from the .NET world, making changes to the Next config.js directly are kind of like making changes directly to the web config. Don't do that. So the Sitecore Next.js SDK has a really nice feature called config plugins that lets you modify the Next config without editing it directly. So in a new Next.js application, you can find some examples of the config plugins in the lib next config plugins folder. And so instead of modifying the Next.js config directly, what you can do is you can just create a plugin in this folder that changes small pieces of the config. The Sitecore Next.js SDK at build time will then combine all of these plugins with the next config.js. So if you're coming from the .NET world, this is very similar to Sitecore config patches and web config transforms. So let's take a look at a simple example. Over here, what I've got in the screenshot, this is pretty much the template that you'll always use for config plugins. But say that you wanted to disable the X powered by header that Next.js includes in every response. Of course, you can modify the next config.js directly and set powered by header to false, but putting this kind of thing in a config plugin helps keep your next config clean. So here we've just created a plugin in the plugins folder, and yeah, you just set the powered by header to false like you would in the next config.js, and at build time, this will get compiled with your next config. This is a very simple and contrived example, but these plugins can get complex quite quickly. I mean, imagine that you have a bunch of rewrite rules or redirect rules that a feature depends on in your application. It's nice to put them in a file by themselves and keep them all together rather than keep making your next config a lot bigger. Just remember that anytime that you create or change a plugin that you're going to have to rebuild your application, hot reloading won't pick up config changes. So to recap, don't edit the next config.js directly. Instead, you can change Next.js settings with plugins created in the next config plugins folder that I've shown there. And always rebuild your app after creating or modifying plugins. Okay, this tip is going to help you get a better understanding of your website payloads. Next.js has a nice utility called Bundle Analyzer that you can install in your projects. To use it, you just run npm install in your project like this. And then going back to our previous tip on config plugins, create a config plugin like I've shown here. I recommend setting the bundle analyzer to enable when the analyze environment variable is true, and also set open analyzer to false. The open analyzer option is quite annoying. What it does is it opens the bundle analyzer in your browser every time your application builds. So in no time, you'll have like 1,000 tabs in your browser. Just set that to false right out of the gate. So once you've got your config plugin created, go into your .env file and set analyze to true, and this will enable bundle analyzer. And then the next time that your application is built, bundle analyzer will output a page for your client bundle and one page for your server-side bundle at these two paths. The client bundle, of course, is going to be client.html, and the server bundle page is going to be the node.js.html page. When you open up the client.html page for a headless SXA site, this is what it's going to look like. It's quite cool. It's organized by all the different chunks for your application. There's a chunk for main.js. There's one for the 404.js page, one for the page route, and then one for the app. You can see within the page route and the 404 routes all the includes from the node modules folder. And you can see that the node modules folder is contributing the most space to those chunks. You can also see over here to the right of each of those chunks, all the components that are getting included. And you can mouse over any of these individual blocks and see how much space they're contributing to your bundles. There's a sidebar where you can filter what you see. So if you want to zoom in on a particular chunk, like the page route, you can do that, and it'll get bigger on the page. Again, you can see that the node modules are contributing the most amount of space to this chunk. Here, now that we're zoomed in, you can see that the Sitecore JSS libraries are contributing quite a bit as well. And then here are all the components that are getting included for this page. The server-side bundle looks quite a bit different than the client-side bundle because there are things that are included on the server that are not included in the client-side bundles and vice versa. For example, you can see this document.js is included in every one of the chunks on the server, but that wasn't on any of the browser chunks. And that's because of the fact that document.js is only executed on the server so it doesn't get included in the browser. So to recap, you can use Next.js Bundle Analyzer to diagnose bundle sizes. Really handy to find code that doesn't belong in the browser, so you can get that stuff out of there. And then you can enable this very easily with a config plugin. The documentation for the Next.js Bundle Analyzer is here. All right, this is a tip about a great node package called patch package. Patch package lets you patch files in the node modules folder and share them with your team. So these patches will get integrated into your repo and your code base, and they'll even make it into production builds. To use it, you use npm install and install patch package in your project. And then open up your package JSON and add a post install script that calls patch package as I've done here. This tells npm to run patch package and apply patches after npm install runs. Next, modify some stuff in your node modules folder. For example, this is the file for the isEven module. You can go and open that directly in node modules, make some changes. For example, you could make isEven return true always on Mondays. And then once you've made that change directly in your node modules folder, go to your console and run npx patch package and give it the name of the module that you modified. In our case, it's isEven. Patch package will then go and create a temporary folder, and it'll pull down a clean copy of isEven and do a diff against the isEven folder in your node modules folder. It'll create a patch file from that diff and put it in the patches folder in your repo. Then patch package will even give you a handy command that you can use to create an issue for the package maintainer. So if you're fixing a bug or something like that, you could use this command to go and create an issue on GitHub for that package and let the package maintainers know about this. This is what the patch file will look like. Again, this is going to get created in the patches folder at the root of your repo. You then check this into source control. And the next time someone pulls down the latest from your repo, when they run npm install, after npm install finishes, patch package will get called, and it'll apply all of the patches in the patches folder to their node modules folder. So that's really awesome, but I want to caution to use this tool sparingly. It's a powerful tool that can easily be abused. If you find bugs in packages and you need to use this tool, you must report them to the package maintainers. But the thing is, we've got to be realistic. Quite often, we can't upgrade a package version, like we can't upgrade a JSS package version because we're pinned to the version supported by the version of Sitecore that we're using. So this tool can be very handy to backport bug fixes, for example. So if you see like in one of the newer versions of the JSS packages that a bug has been fixed or a new feature has been added, you can actually use patch package to backport those bug fixes or features to your version of JSS. So to recap, you can use patch package to modify node modules. Patches created by patch package get created in the patches folder in your repo. You check these into Git and share them with your team. Just make sure that you're always submitting issues for patches you create to the package maintainers and use this tool sparingly. And here's the documentation for patch package if you'd like to read that. And I think we've got a few minutes for questions. I can be found at all these different places if you'd like to reach out to me, but happy to take some questions now.
We have 2 questions on chat.
So I've got one question. Assuming these error debugging is for container plus Sitecore JSS only. So the debug logging that I talked about before is indeed only for Sitecore JSS, but it's not just for containers. So you can turn on debug logging even if you're using, if you're not using containers at all. It'll work with both. The other question is, can we enable both type debug in the same time? Could you clarify what you mean by both types of debug?
I guess here he means the debugger at the browser level and at the CLI level.
Yeah, if that's the question. So if the question is, can you enable both in the server console and the browser at the same time? Absolutely. They're independent, so you can have both going at the same time, no problem. Anything else?
I guess we have covered all the questions. And thanks, Corey, for all the information that you shared through your presentation. And the tips were really great and helpful. And I hope it will help everyone in their existing and upcoming projects and Sitecore. Thanks a lot once again, Jim and Corey, for your time to present in the Sitecore User Group Jaipur. And we will come again next month with another insightful session in Sitecore. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thanks, Corey and
Thanks a
Jim,
lot.
and thanks everyone for joining. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.